Good evening, this is Debbie Snedden. I'm going to give a presentation on the book Results Now. I really enjoyed this book, and I think the biggest reason I enjoyed it was because it's very current, and even though the book was written a few years ago, it really is a book that addresses some of the current understandings of what's going on in the nation as far as with our the way that we look at education. This particular quote that I have in here, or this source that I have in here, is what was found on the White House issues.gov, and it was basically Obama's state of what he thinks for his educational platform, which is to prepare Americans for the jobs of the future and help restore middle-class security. We have to out-educate the world, and that starts with a strong school system. So I think that's kind of the theme for this book too, is how do we not just, how are we preparing our students for the future? The overall argument for the book, there's actually two. The big ones is that instruction itself has the largest influence on achievement. Most, though not all, instruction, despite our best intentions, is not effective, but could improve significantly and swiftly through ordinary and accessible arrangements among teachers and administrators. I think what I really liked about this book was, and this is something that I've talked with some of my colleagues in the past, was it's not about the money. It's not about spending an enormous amount of effort. Some of this is using common sense, and a common sense of where we currently are and what our realities are, and then addressing those realities. The book is pretty simplistic. It's laid out in three big sections: the reality and illusion in public schools, which basically breaks down where we currently are and the things that public schools should be looking at. Section 2 addresses literacy education and the greatest opportunity for all. The author, Mike Schmoker, is actually, his background is English education, which I think is interesting to me because I'm a math educator. So seeing this through the lens of a literacy expert, I don't know that I totally agree sometimes, because of course I'm looking through the lens of a mathematics person, and he looks through the lens of this literacy, through a literacy approach. Section 3 is learning and leading in the professional learning communities, and he kind of talks about a systematic way of collaboration and what schools can do now to come together and try to get some really quick results. So the first section of the book is about the reality of the current reality of where we are in our public schools and the illusion that we're in public schools. And what Mr. Schmoker talks about is that we should, as leaders, we should be looking in classrooms for school-wide patterns. What is it that we see when we do our walkthroughs? What is the general quality and substance of the instruction? And student attentiveness. Are most of the kids on task? That's what we should be looking for when we do those walkthroughs. In the book, he talks a lot about the buffer, and this was actually from the work of Richard Elmore, which states that schools are protected by a barrier. It's kind of like the, kind of in a sci-fi movie, it's that protective barrier that surrounds us. A buffer that discourages and even punishes close, constructive scrutiny of instruction, the supervision of instruction. Its primary effect is to protect those to the heart of schooling from outside inspection, interference, or disruption. So it's kind of like the we know it's wrong, but nobody's going to really do anything approach. So it's kind of to protect the status quo, so to speak. The author talks about the difference, the know and do gap. He states that in this day and age with best practices and all the research that's out there, educators basically know what to do. It's just that for whatever reason, they don't implement with fidelity and consistency. And a lot of times, just from being in the public schools, a lot of times this is based on the pressures that we get from external forces such as parents and the community. Basically, even it could even be the standardized testing that we just have to get things done, and sometimes we can't do what the best practices are because we're so worried about what the consequences are of taking risks. So all these are taken in consideration when we have this know and do gap. An effective lesson, as Schmoker puts it, is just kind of lesson planning 101. Should have an essential, clearly defined learning objective, careful modeling or clear sequence of steps, efforts by the classroom teacher to check for students who are paying attention or learning materials. So, of course, some kind of assessment component. In the book, he gives lots of research and he gives a lot of examples, but I thought this one was an interesting one because when you read the Ravitch book, it actually kind of, in her book, Diane Ravitch actually states the same type of statistics, but it was interesting to me how when she was using the statistics, she was kind of putting a twist on it and explaining it one way. And in the Schmoker book, he's explaining it that this is one of the impacts that we could increase, and we could actually see some results. And so it was just interesting how the two books really contradicted itself when they talk about NAEP testing and international testing. But to get back on track here, 38% of all fourth graders in the U.S., almost 4 out of 10 then, as he puts it, read at below basic level on the NAEP test. And by 8th grade, 43% of poor students are reading at the below basic level. In math, 61% of black students and 53% of Latino students perform at the below basic level. So he's stating that if we just do these, if we look at what our realities are and address what we call just the facts, and we look at it with, just head on, that we actually address this and we can address it quickly. Next, he talks about the curricular chaos, and he talks about how disconnected the curriculum is. And he uses the work of Bob Marzano, who basically states in most of his work, and this isn't something that's really new. Robert Marzano talks about this all the time, about how we can affect student achievement by just making sure that we have a guaranteed and viable curriculum, that we make sure that the discrepancy between the intended curriculum and the actual implemented, what we do when we shut that door, there shouldn't be a disconnect. And this quote kind of talks about how non-educators and educators are very surprised when they find out that the intended curriculum isn't exactly what's implemented. So going back to the buffer, real schools, real consequences, I really related to this since I was hired 2 weeks before our new superintendent at the school system I'm working at. And I really, really enjoy my new school system. However, they have had such changes and changeover in administrators over the past, it's just a history of it. I don't know if that's good job security for me or not, but they've had many superintendents. They've had, in my building alone, they've had many. One of the teachers called my school a training ground for principals, that they just keep going through principals. And so a lot of the things that I'm addressing going into this building is exactly what I read about in this section of the book. They use an example of a new superintendent who speaks of the school district that is just a ship adrift with no consistent curriculum in any of the schools. Teachers worked in isolation and never talked to each other. I find it interesting because when I was trying to empower the teachers in my building and start some professional learning communities, or even before I even started, and I called some of the teachers and I said, hey, I got to hire a teacher, you want to come in and do some interviews with me? You'd have thought I reinvented the wheel. They'd never heard of doing it that way. Um, and to me, this is just best practice. This isn't anything out of the ordinary. When the new superintendent, he of course first thing, because there was no curriculum maps, we have to get some curriculum maps together, do some alignments, even though the state's kind of we're kind of all in a holding pattern with the standards issue. But it was interesting that when we were doing the curriculum work and we started doing alignment of standards, again, the things that I took for granted that I just thought that every school system did this, I'm finding that they didn't, and there was no consistency. So I just find it interesting that these are all things that are just easy wins, but it wasn't being done. It was the reality. Leaders heard, and that would be us, that I do this, I know it works, you don't understand our kids. Now, I will say in the schools, I've heard this before in other school systems I've been at, but interesting enough, when I started working with my school system that I'm working with now, I did hear sometimes, I know this works. Right now I'm kind of having a professional argument with my first grade teachers that they want to retain every student that's a little immature. And I'm trying to have a conversation with them about response to intervention and how we don't have to, and that's not best. If you look at the research on retention, it's not a good practice. But then I heard this quote really stung with me because I just heard this last week from one of the first grade teachers is, my 30 years experience tells me that sometimes it's just better off that you hold the student back. And yeah, maybe so. And it was just, I had to kind of listen to the teacher, but then also collaborate and kind of give that teacher some understandings of why, if we had a tight response to intervention approach, that maybe that might be better for the student instead of just holding that child back for another full year. So it was just interesting. Like I said, this slide meant a lot to me because I really connected to it. So in section 2, he starts talking about literacy education and really authentic literacy. And we'll get into that in just a minute, and the components of what makes up authentic literacy, and the current state of literacy and education. I find it interesting that he didn't talk about mathematics at all, and that's just coming from a math person. So I guess that's just the difference of where your perspective lies. So his definition of authentic literacy is basically read, write, and think. Critically examine evidence and text, see the world through multiple viewpoints, make connections and detect patterns among ideas and perspectives, imagine alternatives, what if, what else. So it's really a Socratic, more authentic way to go instead of just looking at and we'll talk a minute about what the current practice is and what we would typically see in a traditional classroom. As I've been talking to the staff that I work with, one of the things that they tried to implement at the school that I'm currently in, of course, is a balanced literacy initiative, and that is best practice, and it is a good approach. I find it interesting that there's still division in my school, and it's because we still have some folks that believe in what we would call the Crayola curriculum, and I kind of giggled when I heard this, but it is so true. He uses an example of seeing an advanced English class, and how when they were doing a novel, they were really showing, in order to show evidence of their understanding of the novel, the kids were asked to do dioramas or a poster or a book cover or a 3D movie poster or something like that. But again, were they really discussing, were they looking at this piece of literature in comparison to another piece? Were they critically reading and reading for meaning and looking at that vocabulary? Or were they just doing, as he puts it, literacy, arts, and crafts? So I had to snicker about that one a little bit, because I totally understand what he's saying. And then being in an elementary school, the next section where he talks about guided reading, and that's been, when I've been doing my observations in my current building, and I have noticed that when we do our guided reading, and what that is, it's a model for small group instruction where the teacher works with a small group of kids based on their reading level, and then the other groups are working in stations. Well, the problem is when they're working in the other two stations and they're not working directly with the staff member, that's a lot of wasted instructional time. It's great that that one group is going to get 20 minutes of one-on-one from the teacher, but then the other two groups are going to get 40 minutes a day where they're not going to be we're back to coloring a worksheet, or they may not be doing something meaningful. Some of the teachers will say, well, I do some authentic, we're doing some writing, we're doing some great things, but what I typically see in a guided reading like this is that there's no assessment. Like, the teachers kind of just use it as busy workstations, and then they don't have a way to assess whether or not what they're having the kids explore in these stations, is it working and is it transferring to their learning objective. And sometimes I don't even see evidence that there is a learning objective. So I just found this section pretty interesting. The next section he talks about is the learning and leading through a professional learning community. And Schmoker, in his book, talks about how professional learning communities is the quickest way to improve instruction. And leadership, he talks about leadership in the professional learning community, what's the leader's role, and then he talks about the coordinated efforts between a professional learning community, between the states, the districts, classrooms, and the students. Now, the fundamental concepts of a professional learning community is basically that data drives the analysis of data and how it drives instruction. I find that I started doing this with my staff this year, but I find it, again, it's pretty commonplace, but it's interesting how they've been asked to collect all this data, and we all know this, that we collect all this data, but we never really have an intention of teaching the teachers what to do with this. And so if we set up a professional learning community where an administrator really meets with them and directs the staff, and then you can get some really nice, meaningful communication. The second part talks about the focus on essential common standards and aligned with state assessments and providing a guaranteed and viable curriculum. Well, and of course in Indiana, I say this with a little bit of a wink and nod here, it just would be nice to have those standards, wink wink, but hopefully after the 28th of April we'll have that in place, and so we can actually do number 2. And then, of course, collaboration among teachers and administrators. That, I think, it's got to be more than just talk. We always hear that, and I've heard this in some of my past lives and some of my past buildings, where an administrator would come in and say, well, I'm a collaborator, and then they turn around and then they give top-down management. So you have to make sure that what you say and what you do are still going on. And then we need to start empowering our teachers. We still need to hold them accountable, absolutely. But I think we need to respect their professionalism, and we have to come in with an assumption that they want to do the best. We need to raise those bars. Sure, there's going to be those occasional teachers that we're going to have to put, but then you work with the ones that you can get success with, and then for the others it's going to be the see the light or feel the heat. And I think that that's the thing that really will drive this. You really need to get the people in your court, the ones that you can make some progress with. And I think we spend so much time in administrators worrying about the one or two that we can't get on board, and if we just would kind of work with the other ones, then hopefully we can get the other ones to put pressure on the ones that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. The next section was kind of his way of addressing teacher evaluation. And I thought this was really interesting, that instead of doing, now granted, we have some requirements that we have to do with teacher evaluation in the rubrics and the way we do this, but I think if we use those rubrics to do curriculum reviews, so that when we meet with professional learning communities, this is how we review. As we go through those formative assessments and we talk about the administrator's going to know what's going on in those classes if we're looking at that data together. If we're looking at the grade book and looking at what is the quality of the assignments and how are we grading. The team, are we doing some lesson studies? Can we do some quick lesson studies? Get them to the lesson level. If you talk to a team and you say, hey, what are the big ideas? What are the things that this group of teachers, that all your students are having trouble with? If all of the students are having trouble with fractions, for example, can we develop some great lesson plans as a team, and then we can try it in so-and-so's room, and if that doesn't work, we'll watch that lesson, and then we'll make improvements on it, and then we'll go into the next person's room, and then we'll make improvements on it, and then we'll go to the next person's room, and we'll make improvements on it, and then once we like that lesson, then we'll put it in the lesson blank, and then that's what we'll all use. So again, that ensures the consistency and the guaranteed and viable curriculum. Also looking at students' work, looking at the quality of the students' work. Is it that they're just doing a product, or are they really showing evidence of the understandings? The next part of the book talks about the role of the leader and the shifting of the leader from the instructional leader to the learning leader. So instead of just doing a passive approach, which is a traditional approach where you just sit into a classroom and you just observe, you're taking more time discussing and supporting the learning that actually went on, more time discussing short-term results with teams. So that's looking at that actual data and monitoring, supporting the success on those assessments. I really like this quote, that it really sets up that sense of urgency. A lot of times we kind of use children as our human guinea pigs, and I think we've got to be really cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of children who are suffering, and we should not have to wait another generation before we get things right. And we need to develop that sense of urgency in people. The last part of the book talks about how he puts together the district and how the district and the schools, and it just continues on with the professional learning communities and how all of these different entities should collaborate and work together. But the last quote of the book, I kind of just wanted to, as I leave you and leave you with this final thought. As I finished up the book, I really think it's a quick read. It's a wonderful way, again, just common sense approach to getting in there, rolling up your sleeves, and turning around a school quickly. If the current school system, I'm going to read the quote, if the current school system wishes to survive against the increasing encroachment on its autonomy, perhaps its very existence, then there is only one worthy course of action: for teachers and school leaders at the state, district, and school level to immediately and relentlessly bring to share, examine, and engage in a dialogue about these realities on every occasion until our actions and commitments begin to erase the awful inertia of our past decades. And I think that's really telling about the current status of where we are, and the fact that the legislators get involved, and the fact that the parents are getting involved. But the parents are being impacted by the media and the social media. That when we don't take that active role of looking at and to be our own critic, and not in a negative way, but just getting in there and saying, you know what, there are some realities and there is some truth to the fact that we have some things that we need to change and that we could do better on. And that we go on from there and stop this blame game thing and just do what's best for kids. So for the last part of this, which is for millions of children, we can change the world. Let's just start with this school year. So let's just start where we're at and stop worrying about the past. Let's just move forward. Thank you very much for putting up with my technology flaws. For some reason, I had some trouble with that collaborate, so I just kind of threw some audio on a PowerPoint. So I don't know if this is the most entertaining way to do this. I really enjoyed the book. I really enjoyed doing this presentation, and I hope that this has been beneficial for all of you.